Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. It's widely believed that the United States is on the verge of a stunning demographic reversal. According to this view, in just a little over 20 years, whites will no longer be a majority of the US population. My guest says, not so fast. He's Richard Alba, a distinguished professor of sociology at the City University Graduate Center and the author of a terrific new book, The Great Demographic Illusion: Majority, Minority, and the Expanding American Mainstream. Professor Alba, welcome. Thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Bob. I really also appreciate your welcoming me.
So this idea has become an article of faith with an awful lot of people that pretty soon whites will no longer be a majority of the population. You are saying that the situation is much more complex than that. So what is this illusion that you've written a book about?
Yeah, okay. So the illusion is precisely this narrative, which we call the majority-minority narrative, because whites becoming a minority also implies that collectively people of color will become the majority. And first of all, I think that we should be suspicious of this narrative because it's inherently divisive. We have very good social psychological research now that shows that many whites, when reminded about this future, become anxious, they become angry, they become more conservative in their attitudes. And I think there's good reason to believe that it fed into the so-called racial resentment that political scientists argue tipped the 2016 election in favor of Donald Trump. But in addition, the book shows that the majority-minority narrative is based on flawed demographic data, and in addition, that it really overlooks, I think, an important pattern of assimilation, especially among Asians and Hispanics, that is expanding the white-dominated mainstream and creating, if you will, a new kind of majority in American society, one that's more inclusive.
But there is, in fact, there are demographic changes underway and they've been underway for quite a while. So give us a sense of what's really going on in
Yeah.
terms of the changes. What is happening with the US population?
Okay, well, for sure. The American population is becoming much more diverse as a result of immigration. So we're really talking about changes that have occurred over the last half century because they were really spurred by the 1965 Immigration Act, and they didn't really begin to show themselves until the late 1960s. So it's really been a kind of increasing impact of immigration from Asia, from Latin America, from the Caribbean, and now also from Africa on the American population. So for sure, we're becoming more diverse racially. We're becoming, less a nation of people of exclusively European ancestry. But we've been through this before. And so in the early 20th century, there were the same fears of the majority American population being engulfed by waves of immigrants, that time coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And it didn't happen, and it didn't happen in part because of assimilation, because the descendants of those immigrants became part of the American white Judeo-Christian mainstream, a mainstream that was different after mid-century from what it had been prior to the middle of the 20th century. Well, on a more modest scale, we're experiencing something similar today, and that is that the descendants, some of the descendants of immigrants, especially Hispanics and Asians, are really becoming a part of the American mainstream. And we can see this through the rise of ethno-racial mixing in families. So we've seen a steady increase in intermarriage since 1967, when the last of the anti-intermarriage laws was ruled unenforceable, basically, by the U.S. Supreme Court. And we're seeing a very steady rise in the number of young people, young Americans, who come from mixed families where one parent is white and one parent is minority. And in the main, these young people are not being treated as minorities in American society. They're kind of joining the mainstream in American society. They're moving upwards educationally and occupationally. They're intermarrying with whites. And it's an expansion that is reminiscent of the expansion that we saw at the end of World War II.
I just want to address another aspect of the consequences of sort of the illusion that you were talking about. You've mentioned already sort of the anxiety that has been felt by a lot of whites in this country about either their role or their percentage of the population, perhaps loss of status or whatever. The flip side of that is, it seems to me that a lot of liberals, progressives, people of color in many instances feel that some additional political power is going to inevitably fall their way simply because of increasing demographic numbers. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, well, okay. I think, first of all, I think that increasing political power is coming their way. And we can see that in congressional elections, even in elections to the nation's highest office. So now we have the second non-white candidate for national office in this century. And I think it's interesting to point out that both Barack Obama and Kamala Harris are the children of non-white immigrants
Right.
rather than African Americans, say. Um, and so I mean, without question, that's happening. But it's also what's also happening is that the expectation that whites are somehow going to be dethroned, and and that instead there's going to be a majority that is made up of people of color, a political majority. That, I think, is something that is very unlikely and that we ought to be suspicious of. And just as a reminder about what happened with the assimilation of white ethnics following World War II, especially for the largest group among them, that is ethnic Catholics, Irish, Italians, Poles. As a consequence of assimilation, they became politically like the whites they were assimilating into. And I think we don't know. I don't want to say that I can predict with certainty what's going to happen, but I think that assuming that people of color are going to remain, in some sense, politically unified on the left, I think is a very poor assumption and is very unlikely to work out as
Right.
expected.
So let's talk about the intermarriages that are occurring and the mixed families that we've seen. I thought it was interesting. It was quite some time ago. My wife and I started noticing that in television commercials, more and more often, you saw mixed families in the commercial. So I don't know, maybe they're selling cereal and it's a mixed family around the breakfast table, or purchasing a car. So you see the family piling into an SUV or something of that nature. When I was growing up, that was an absolute no-no. There is no way you would ever have seen an interracial or otherwise interethnic mix in a television commercial. So when we were discussing it, we said, hey, there must be something going on. These corporations have noticed something. And of course, what's going on is that there's been a sharp increase in these mixed families that you discuss at length in your book. So can you talk about that a little bit?
I think we should actually just first talk a little bit about intermarriage. So,
Mm-hmm.
as we know, intermarriage was illegal in many American states until the late 1960s, when the Supreme Court, in a wonderfully named decision, Loving v. Virginia, ruled
When
out.
I first saw it, I had to just go back and make sure that I wasn't misreading something
Yeah,
there.
no, how could you. It's really the finger of God pointing to
Right,
something important. Yeah, no, it's a
right,
wonderfully named decision. And I think so. Since then, there's been a steady rise in intermarriage. Today, one of every 6 new marriages crosses a major ethno-racial dividing line. White with black, white with Hispanic, Asian with black. All of these are happening to some extent. But the big pattern is whites marrying with minorities. That's about
right,
80% of the intermarriages that are taking place today. And of course, what this also then means is many children who are coming out of mixed family backgrounds. And here I include children who are not necessarily the children of a married couple, but a couple that may
right.
live together, or in some other way form a family. So we know that 15% of babies born in the United States have parents from different major ethno-racial categories. And the great majority, like the majority certainly, 75%, have a white parent and a non-white parent. And
Right.
by the way, the biggest group, a group that's sort of hidden, because we don't really think of it as so much as an intermarriage or a mixed background, is made up of children with one white parent and one Hispanic parent. And the next group, but much smaller, is children with a white parent and a black parent.
Right.
So you mentioned Asians and Hispanics, and relative to their group sizes, they have higher rates of mixing with whites than African Americans do. So we know that, for example, that among US born Hispanics, about 35% marry whites, and it's similar with US born Asians, and it's considerably smaller with US born African Americans.
Now, the answer to this would seem obvious, but I'd like you to discuss it. Why is it that intermarriages and interracial relationships between blacks and whites are substantially
Yeah. Well,
lower than
yeah.
among Asians and whites or Hispanics and
Well,
whites?
so I think we have to recognize here that there's something very important in American society about the treatment of people of color, and that race is not the only factor. It's also how groups arrive. There's a big difference in the way Americans treat immigrants and their descendants. After all, that is seen by whites as like the American story, a continent peopled by immigrants.
A
Um,
nation of immigrants,
a
right?
nation of immigrants, yes. And then the way African Americans, people who entered the United States as slaves or as conquered peoples like Native Americans, they're treated differently. And there's still, very harsh racism directed against African Americans. And by the way, we know from the surveys of people of mixed background that those who are part white and part African American also suffer from this racism. And this racism is extremely evident in the way police treat civilians.
And by extension, these difficulties with the police often occur among the children of black and white mixed
Correct.
families,
Absolutely.
as well as the
Yeah.
children of African Americans,
Yeah.
two
So
African
those
Americans.
children coming from mixed white black families learn early in life that they're going to be treated as minorities. They deal with racism on an everyday basis. That is not true from our survey evidence for the children of white Asian families or the children of white Hispanic families.
So can we talk about assimilation a little bit? This is a significant aspect of your book. And your contention in the book has been that historically assimilation has been more elastic, less rigid than is widely perceived in this country. Can you elaborate on that a little
Yeah,
bit?
well, thank you for putting it that way. And I think that's right. So a lot of Americans have a notion of assimilation that regards it as a kind of an obliteration of people's origins and a taking on of the characteristics of the majority part of the society. But that's not actually the way assimilation has worked historically. And I think there are some important lessons to take away from the post-World War II assimilation of the so-called white ethnics. These were people who not only were sort of ethnically different from the Anglo-Saxon Protestant core, but they were religiously different. They were Catholics and Jews. And Catholicism particularly has a very stigmatized history in the United States because the Protestants who founded this country wanted to distinguish their society from the hierarchical Roman Catholic societies in parts of Europe. And there was a great deal of anti-Catholicism prior to about 1960.
Excuse me a minute, just you mentioned 1960, and I remember when John F. Kennedy was running for president, and it was such a big deal that a Catholic had a chance of winning the
Absolutely.
presidency. And of course, he actually went on to win it, and it got almost as much attention as Barack Obama becoming the first African American president. So it was an enormous deal
They
in
were
those
they were
days.
really events, I think, on the same plane.
Right,
And you may remember that before he was elected, Kennedy actually went to meet with a large number of Protestant ministers to assure them that he would not be making decisions as president because they were part of his Roman Catholic
right.
faith. But here's the key point. The key point is that Jews and Protestants joined the mainstream without having to surrender their religions.
Right.
And not only that, they continued to assert distinctive ethnic
I mean,
identities.
excuse me, Jews and Catholics
Did
joined the
I
main.
say, okay, if I
You
misspoke,
said
yeah.
Jews and Protestants,
Oh,
yeah,
did I? Jews and Catholics, yes,
yeah.
join the mainstream without having to surrender their religions. And they continued to assert ethnically distinct identities. So, Italian American became a very distinct identity. There are lots of movies, made by Martin Scorsese
Yeah.
and Francis Ford Coppola about the Italian American experience. Um, and so it wasn't an extinguished identity. It was something that was still felt very alive. So I think in thinking about assimilation today, we should recognize that people who are assimilating, who come from non-European backgrounds, are not very unlikely to be forced to uh, forego those backgrounds. In other words, they're going to continue to be able, in a muted way, of course, I mean, not in a harsh way, in a
Right.
muted way to assert distinctive identities, even though they're now part of the mainstream society. So assimilation is not what we have thought, I think.
When we talk about the assimilation of the white ethnics in the post-World War II decades, of course, that occurred during a time of a booming economy, and the U.S. was making tremendous investments in education and infrastructure and that sort of thing, which made it easier, I think, for some groups to assimilate because, the old phrase about um, uh, a rising tide lifts all boats, that sort of thing was going on. And in fact, African Americans were doing much better in those decades as well. We have these demographic changes underway now, but we don't have, we have the opposite of a booming economy. And we don't have the country making those kinds of investments in education and infrastructure and so forth. So what are the implications of that? Does that make it more difficult for assimilation to occur?
Well, I think okay, very good question, by the way. I think what it implies is that assimilation doesn't have the same magnitude, the same extent of bringing people into the mainstream, many, many people into the mainstream, as it did in the post-World War II era. So you could say in the post-World War II era that it was assimilation en masse. Um, Distinctions that had been important sort of withered away. Today, we have a much more selective assimilation because we're not enjoying this period of enormous economic expansion. But the force I think that's propelling assimilation is demographic change. And particularly important here is that the huge and heavily white baby boom, which has been very successful. You know, the first group to really experience mass higher education, large numbers of individuals who were highly placed in the American labor force, they're retiring. And the young people of America, the cohorts, you might say, demographers refer to birth cohorts, people born in a certain period. So the birth cohorts that are rising uh, to replace them don't have as many whites. So in a sense, there's a kind of room being created because these very large groups of whites are retiring and there are fewer whites around to replace them. The result is, and we can see it, and the evidence is very clear, that the top of the labor force, let's say the top quarter of the labor force, is really changing. And there are many more Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans that are moving into the top quarter. And when we look at higher education, which is preparing people for the top jobs, the changes are even more profound. So if you look at the elite tier of higher education, not just the Ivy League, but also, you know, the top public colleges like the University of Michigan or of Wisconsin, you see that whites have really dramatically fallen as a percentage of the graduating classes. And the graduating classes have many more people of color, but especially people coming from immigration backgrounds, as opposed, I'm sorry to say, to African Americans.
So, and you anticipate my next question. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the difficulty of African Americans and children of mixed families where one parent is Black. Talk about some of the difficulties they
Yeah.
have when it
All
comes to
right. So,
assimilation.
you know, so I think that one way to think about it is that the children coming from immigrant mixed backgrounds, where you have a white parent and a parent who has a recent immigration background, Asian or Hispanic, are positioned very differently in American society from African American children and from most of the children who are white and Black. Their families are more affluent, more educated, because education actually in the parental generation is connected with mixing. They live in neighborhoods that are mixed but also contain many whites. There's good evidence that they have friendships with whites early on in life, so that they're really comfortable, you know, mixing in a world, the worlds that are required for social ascent, worlds that have many whites in them. African American children and children coming from white Black family backgrounds grow up much poorer. They grow up in more segregated neighborhoods. Um, in these neighborhoods, they do not receive as many encouraging signs to think that they can ascend
Right.
socioeconomically, and they don't have the exposure to whites, and to they don't have the experience of getting along with whites. that these other children do. So, I mean, whites are still a very powerful group. By the way, one of the mysteries, one of the things that people get wrong about these demographic projections is that even if the projections are correct, and I
Right.
contend they're not, whites will still be the effective electoral majority at the national level past mid-century. And this has to do with citizenship differences between whites and people of color, many of whom are immigrants.
Yeah.
It has to do with the concentration of people of color among children, which means they're not able to vote, even though they may be citizens, and also then with effective registration and voting patterns. So
Uh,
whites are nowhere near, the minority position that's being anticipated by this scenario.
So a radical shift of power in terms of demographics is unlikely.
Very unlikely.
I think that's such an important point. We've run out of time. We're gonna have to end it there. Professor Richard Alba, thank you so much for coming.
Bob, thank you very much for a great conversation.
Thank you. And to our viewers, thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.